A 13-year-old girl was found with her throat slit. A second body was hidden on the roof of her own home. This is the Aarushi and Hemraj case.
Today, we're diving into an explainer of a case that has literally haunted India for over a decade. It's a story of a brutal double murder in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, one that sparked a catastrophic investigation, a complete media circus, and left behind a legal saga with way more questions than answers. Now, it's incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction here, but we're going to break it down step by step. And just a quick heads up before we really get into it, there is one specific, staggering statistic about the crime scene evidence that we'll be looking at shortly. It's a number that explains exactly why everything in this case went so disastrously wrong. Keep that in mind.
Chapter 1. The Crime. So, our story begins in 2008 in Noida, a really bustling city just outside of New Delhi. This was the home of the Talwar family. You've got Rajesh and Nupur, both successful dentists, living there with their bright 13-year-old daughter, Aarushi. And by all accounts, they were a perfectly happy family. In fact, the evening of May 15th started out just like any other, with them taking photos with a brand new camera. But then the timeline suddenly shifts. Around 11:30 p.m., calls made to the house's landline go completely unanswered. Hours pass. By the next morning, the family's housemaid arrives at the door, rings the bell repeatedly, and when she's finally let inside, the scene is absolutely horrific. 13-year-old Aarushi is found dead in her bed. Her throat had been slit.
Immediately, panic sets in, and the police quickly realize that someone else is missing, the family's live-in domestic worker, Hemraj. So for the local police, the conclusion seemed, well, incredibly straightforward. They just assumed Hemraj had killed Aarushi and fled into the night. Just like that, he instantly became the prime and really the only suspect.
Chapter 2. The investigation collapses.
Now, the first 48 hours of any murder investigation are universally known to be the most critical window to secure justice, right? But in this case, those hours were an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The very next day, a retired police officer who was visiting the grieving family insisted that authorities check the locked terrace of the home. When the police finally broke that lock and went up, they found him, Hemraj. He wasn't the killer on the run, he was the second victim. His body had been hidden on the roof, and just like Aarushi, his throat was also slit. This discovery changed absolutely everything, and it's exactly where the investigation fundamentally broke down into complete and utter chaos. The apartment essentially became a textbook example of how not to secure a crime scene. Instead of locking it down, it effectively turned into a public thoroughfare. You had media, neighbors, and extended family members walking freely all over the place. Unbelievably, Arushi's room was actually cleaned. A crucial unidentified bloody palm print found at the scene, touched by dozens of people. The site was just completely, hopelessly contaminated. And this brings us to that number I mentioned at the very beginning, 90%. Investigators later estimated that up to 90% of all physical evidence was lost forever in just those first 48 hours. Because of this catastrophic failure to secure the scene, the search for the truth began with an almost insurmountable handicap. Any physical trace of the killer was virtually wiped away. Chapter 3. The Suspects.
So, with a thoroughly contaminated crime scene and now 2 victims, authorities were left grasping at straws. The investigation split, pivoting dramatically between 2 entirely different and competing theories. On one side, you had the local police pointing straight at the parents, Rajesh and Nupur Talwar. They claimed it was an honor killing, basing this on the fact that there were no signs of forced entry. To them, that meant it had to be an inside job. But on the other side, India's top investigative agency, the CBI, developed a completely different theory. They focused on 3 other domestic workers from the neighborhood, suggesting that they were led into the home by Hemraj, and that things just escalated horribly from there.
But the CBI's case against those 3 domestic workers had a massive, glaring flaw. It was built almost entirely on narco tests. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially a truth serum. It's a scientifically unreliable interrogation technique, and crucially, any statements made under its influence are completely inadmissible as primary evidence in Indian courts. So this was a foundation built entirely on sand.
And because of that, the case against the 3 workers completely crumbled. Their stories were totally inconsistent. Plus, because of that 90% evidence loss we talked about, there was absolutely zero physical evidence putting them at the scene. And, maybe most importantly, all 3 men actually had verified alibis for the night of the murders. So, with this entire theory collapsing in on itself, the investigation was forced right back to square one. Chapter 4. The Trial. With the domestic workers cleared, the focus swung dramatically back to Arushi's parents. The CBI went
all in on building a case against Rajesh and Talwar, but man, they faced an uphill battle. There was absolutely no direct proof. They never found a definitive murder weapon. There was no confession, and zero definitive DNA linking the parents to the murders. Because of that botched initial investigation, the prosecution's entire case had to rest on a highly fragile chain of circumstantial evidence.
The courtroom turned into this intense, bitter battle over every single piece of circumstance. The prosecution claimed the parents must have heard the murders happening in the next room, but the defense countered by proving that the really loud window unit air conditioner in the parents' room easily masked the noise. Then, the prosecution pointed to a golf club owned by Rajesh as the likely murder weapon. The defense shot back that absolutely no DNA or blood was ever found on that club. For literally every accusation, the defense offered a plausible counterargument, systematically creating some very significant reasonable doubt.
And yet, in a decision that completely stunned the nation, the trial court found them guilty. Despite the glaring lack of hard evidence and the deeply flawed initial investigation, a judge convicted Rajesh and Talwar of murdering their own daughter and their employee. They were sentenced to life in prison.
This sentiment in the courtroom was just shocking. In his verdict, the trial judge actually called the parents freaks in the history of mankind. It was incredibly harsh language, right? But it directly reflected the heavy public sentiment at the time, a sentiment that was intensely fueled by relentless, sensationalized media coverage that painted the parents as undeniably guilty.
But as you might guess, the legal saga was far from over. 4 years later, the Talwars' appeal reached the High Court, and the higher court reviewed the exact same scattered, circumstantial evidence that the trial court did, but they reached the completely opposite conclusion. The prosecution, they ruled, had entirely failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The parents were acquitted, and they walked free. The High Court's review of the original verdict was honestly a brutal rebuke. They stated that the trial judge acted like a film director who was forcing a narrative onto scattered facts rather than impartially following the evidence. It was a really powerful indictment of the entire prosecution, and obviously a massive validation for the defense.
Chapter 5. Hemraj, the Forgotten Victim.
Behind the bungled investigations, the dramatic court battles, and the endless media circus, there is a profound human cost here that has been largely overshadowed. Today, the case is trapped in a permanent state of ambiguity. The parents were convicted, then freed. Other suspects were arrested, then released. Officially, the murders remain completely unsolved. Now the CBI has appealed the acquittal, so the legal battles do technically continue. But the public remains fiercely divided, and the permanent damage caused by that intense media trial, well, it simply cannot be undone.
But amidst all the noise that surrounded Aarushi and her parents, we really have to remember the second victim, Hemraj Banjade. He was a man who came to India simply to work and support his family back home. He was brutally murdered, yet his story became little more than a footnote in a national spectacle. His family is still out there, waiting for a justice that, sadly, may never come.
Because of a destroyed crime scene and a completely chaotic search for the truth, we are left staring at a tragic puzzle with no solution in sight. The ultimate reality of this mystery leaves us with one haunting question that continues to echo: who killed Aarushi and Hemraj?